Hi, my name is Ryan Otis, and today I'm going to be talking about Belarus. Now, Belarus is a country that you don't usually hear about in the US, especially not on the news very often, but I feel it's important to talk about, especially in the US, but for anyone watching, that uh, it's a dictatorship in Europe that still exists years after the Cold War. Some call it Europe's last dictatorship, and I think it's important to spread the word about the fact that this is still going on today. So Belarus was a former Soviet satellite, like much of Eastern Europe. It gained independence in 1991. Remember, the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and then Russia itself collapsed in 91 along with some of its satellites like Belarus. So even though it gained independence, it did not gain domestic independence or democracy because Alexander Lukashenko became dictator in 1994 and has still been is still in power, has been in power. He's a dictator all but in name, and Belarus has continued to have ties with Russia because they signed a union treaty in 1999, although that has never been fully implemented. But certainly the friendship between the two countries is still there. So for the executive branch, the presidency has 5-year terms. There are no term limits, and the president is elected by majority popular vote. Now, Lukashenko, again, elected first in 94, re-elected 2001. By that time, the terms themselves were extended by a referendum. Then in 2006, by that time he was re-elected and term limits were removed. He was re-elected again 2010 and then elected most recently 2015. The next election is 2020, and the CIA, who is my source for this video, says that the elections were corrupted by fraud. So we'll talk more about that, but obviously being elected over and over again, that's not a good sign, although it's not necessarily a sign of dictatorship. But if the elections are fraudulent, then obviously it's a flawed democracy. Now, the legislature is known as the National Assembly. The U.S. does not recognize the legitimacy of the National Assembly. There are two houses, the Council of the Republic, which has 64 seats, and the House of Representatives, which has 110 seats. There are 4-year terms for both. The Council has 56 seats elected by regional and Minsk, which is the capital, city councils. And then 8 of the seats are filled by the president's choice. The House, all seats are by majority vote for 1 seat per political area. So all this, the form of this, although maybe the president picking some of the seats, maybe that's not good, but most of this, it's okay on the form of it is okay, is not necessarily anti-democratic. But here we get to the problem of the elections again. So the elections last held for the House, which were in 2016, there were observers from OSCE, which is an organization for joint security in Europe. Those observers said that the election was not free and impartial, and there were vote counting problems at a number of the polling stations. So again, the form of a democracy is in place for the most part, but the elections again are not. They're not free and impartial. They're corrupted. They're controlled by Lukashenko and his supporters. And we can see this by the fact that pro-Lukashenko candidates won virtually every seat, with only 1 opposition member and 1 independent. Again, it's possible that the Belarusians are voting in that many supporters of Lukashenko, but it seems unlikely that there would be that much of a supermajority, that there would only be 2 people in the National Assembly, or in the House, I'm sorry, that were not directly supportive of him. International observers say elections in 2008 and 2012 also fell short of democratic standards, with pro-Lukashenko candidates winning every seat. Again, that doesn't sound right. The elections, there has to be some people, at least more than two, like in the 2016 election, that are of another party that are not pro-Lukashenko. In other words, opposition parties exist. They're allowed to exist, but they seem to be barred from gaining any real power at all. So now on to the judiciary. So there is a Supreme Court and a Constitutional Court. The Constitutional has 12 judges, a chairman and a deputy chairman are included in that. The Supreme Court has a chairman and deputy chairman again. There are also panels, which include economic and military matters being discussed on those panels. There are the number of judges are set by the president and the court chairman. Judges for the Supreme Court are also appointed by the president with consent of the council. Judges are appointed for 5 years and evaluated for life appointment. Again, in fact, that's good that they're not necessarily given automatically life appointment. Obviously, again, if the leader is an authoritarian, then that check on the judiciary is not as important. It doesn't help as much when the leader is an authoritarian. But it's good in and of itself that there are checks, such as not giving automatic life appointment. The Constitutional Court has 6 judges appointed by the president and 6 elected by the council. The presiding judge is elected by the president and approved by the council. This is for the Constitutional Court. Judges can serve 11 years with an age limit of 70. That's good that there's a limit. That's fine. But again, if you have an authoritarian, if the elections that put the president and the council and the House in are fraudulent, then that kind of defeats the purpose of having controls on the judiciary. But again, it's good in and of itself. Of course, there are subordinate courts, finally. So what is it like to live in Belarus? Approximately 71% have internet access. That's not a bad number, but I'm unsure if it's censored. Unsure on that. The CIA website was not clear about whether the internet access is censored. Approximately 80% of industry is state-owned, so the government controls most of the production of goods. The GDP is made up of 70 to 75% state-owned entities, so the entire economy or the production is majority owned by the government. And then even the banks, 75% of the banking system is made up of state banks. Now, economic reform was attempted after independence, but in 1994 that was mostly destroyed, probably due, I would assume, to the election of Lukashenko. For television, there are 7 state channels, although there are Polish and Russian channels available in some areas. For radio, there are 5 state networks plus an external one. I'm not sure what external means on that issue. And then, of course, there are Polish and Russian radio networks available again. The telephone, there is a landline with long distance. It's all state-owned under an organization called Beltelecom. And finally, cell phones, there are 3 major mobile networks, but it's unclear if those are state-controlled. So there should be an independent election oversight organization that comes in and watches the elections, makes sure that they're being done properly, separate from any government, or at least the government of Belarus, but probably it can be a non-governmental organization, an NGO, that makes sure the election is done properly and fairly. I don't know if Belarus, how they do the ballots, but if they don't have bubble-in forms with a machine that reads the form, they probably should use that perhaps as a way of automating the process. But the machines, of course, should be tested for accuracy and a lack of tampering which the election oversight organization probably would be in charge of doing. Now, if Belarus still wants Lukashenko, if they still want to vote for him, that's okay, that's acceptable. But it should be proven by clean elections that the majority still desire him and his supporters to be in power. Remember that FDR, was voted in for 4 terms. He died in the 4th. So it's acceptable for a democracy to vote in the same person multiple times, as long as those elections are clean and fair. Now, of course, term limits, perhaps should, they could be reinstalled. They don't have to be, but they could be as an extra check on the executive, like the U.S. did after FDR. But it's not necessary, but it could be done. For trading, Belarus's main partner is Russia, but some exports also go to the United Kingdom and Ukraine, and imports come in from China and Germany. I would say that it's not surprising that Russia and China trade with Belarus, since those are all have a communist legacy of some sort, so including Belarus. So that it's not surprising that they trade. But for the United Kingdom and Ukraine and Germany to trade, that's doesn't make a lot of sense for their background. The United Kingdom and Germany are NATO countries. Russia is still a threat to NATO. They shouldn't support Belarus when Belarus is a close ally to Russia, who is such a threat to Europe. So they should not trade with Belarus. And Ukraine has a special case, obviously, of being invaded by Russia and Crimea being taken by Russia. So Ukraine definitely shouldn't trade with Belarus when Belarus is so closely tied to Russia. It's against national security for Ukraine and also for the United Kingdom and Germany. So they should all stop the trade. I mean, they really should stop supporting an enemy like that. If you do see a product from Belarus, I would say consider boycotting it. In the U.S., you're probably not going to see products made in Belarus, and in Europe, I don't know if you would. I don't know how many products really come out of there other than maybe oil or other things like that. But if you do see a product made in Belarus, you should probably boycott it, because that money would be going towards supporting this authoritarian regime. Finally, here's some credits and a disclaimer. The images are from the CIA website, the World Factbook on Belarus. The facts cited here are all from the CIA website again, the World Factbook on Belarus. The commentary is by myself, Ryan Otis. This video is not endorsed by the Central Intelligence Agency. Okay, well, thank you. Have a good day.